I woke up to the sound of metal grinding against stone outside my bedroom window. When I pulled the curtain back, I saw a yellow excavator sinking its bucket into the east side of my land, and Lenora Vance, the president of the Homeowners Association, standing near the property line with a coffee cup in her hand like she was inspecting a job she had paid for. I walked out and asked who authorized any digging. Lenora smiled and told me not to make life difficult for people who understood land planning better than I did. But when the operator handed me the work order, I saw one line on that page that Lenora had been hoping I would never read carefully. If you enjoy a satisfying homeowners association reversal, stay with me all the way to the end, because this one turns on a single sheet of paper. My name is Dorian Hale. I am 51 years old, and I have lived on 11.8 acres at the eastern edge of Redwood County for 19 years. My land sits right up against a subdivision called Hawthorne Ridge, but it is not part of Hawthorne Ridge, and that distinction is the whole spine of this story. On the morning it started, I woke a little after 6 because a diesel engine was idling somewhere too close to my house, and under that idle there was a sound I have known my entire working life, the scrape of a steel bucket dragging through gravel and topsoil. I run a small shop that repairs heavy construction equipment. I spent years before that working alongside grading contractors, reading plan sets, walking staked lines, checking cut and fill against a survey, so I did not need to see the machine to know what it was doing. I knew from the pitch of it that somebody was taking material off the ground and stacking it somewhere else. I sat up on the edge of the bed for maybe 4 seconds, which is about how long it takes a man to move from confusion to certainty. Then I crossed to the window and pulled the curtain aside. There it was, a mid-size excavator, 13 or 14 ton, yellow, sitting about 30 feet inside my east property line with a spoil pile already growing behind it. A strip of grass and topsoil had been peeled back like carpet. Somebody had driven survey stakes with orange ribbon down the low ground toward the tree row, and the machine was following them, and standing outside the disturbed area, near the fence corner, in a gray blazer with sunglasses pushed up into her hair and a travel mug in her hand, was Lenora Vance. She was not hurrying. She was not on the phone. She was watching the way a person watches a renovation they commissioned themselves, with a small, pleased tilt of the head. I pulled on jeans and boots and went out the side door. The morning was cool and the air already smelled like cut earth and hydraulic fluid. I walked straight to her, and before I said one word, Lenora spoke first. "You're finally up," she said. "We tried to start early so we wouldn't disturb you." I asked her who we was. I asked her who authorized an excavator to cross onto my property. She took a sip of her coffee first, and that was the tell right there. Because a person who has done something wrong tends to answer fast, and a person who believes she is untouchable takes her time. "The association is performing maintenance on the drainage system," she said. "It's a little more involved than the work you do in that shop of yours, so I won't take up your morning explaining it." I told her plainly, "This is not association property." She smiled at me. "Dorian, the fact that you don't understand what an easement is doesn't mean one doesn't exist." The operator climbed down. Mid-40s, sunburned forearms, a company logo on the shirt that I did not recognize from anywhere in Hawthorne Ridge. He introduced himself as Wade Harlan and asked if there was a problem. I told him he was digging on my land, and I asked him if he had a work order and a permit. He did not get defensive. That is the mark of a man who has been in the trade long enough to know that the worst thing you can be caught inside is somebody else's property dispute. He said, and I remember this exactly, that he was hired to perform work and he was not about to move another bucket until the ownership question was settled. Then he went to the cab, came back with a clipboard, and handed me the packet. The first page had a header at the top that read Hawthorne Ridge Drainage Easement, Instrument 14-7721. I felt Lenora watching me read it. I could feel her satisfaction from 10 feet away, the way you feel heat off an engine block. She thought the game was over. She thought handing a working man a recorded instrument number was the same as handing him a verdict. But I recognized that number. I had seen it 19 years earlier, sitting at a closing table, with a folder of documents in front of me, going through every page because my father taught me that the only free protection you ever get in this life is reading. And here is what Lenora did not know that morning. Instrument 14-7721 was never a permanent easement. I flipped past the first page. I flipped past the second. I went looking for the third page because the third page is where the term is written. The third page was not in the packet. Let me back up and explain what I was to Hawthorne Ridge, and what Hawthorne Ridge had become to me, because none of what happened that morning came out of nowhere. My land was here first. When I bought it, the ridge above me was scrub and cattle lease and a gravel road that turned to soup every February. The developer came in about 6 years after I did, and they built Phase 1 up on the high ground, 40-something houses, with stone veneer and 3-car garages. Then Phase 2 spread down the slope. Then Phase 3 filled the last flat piece, and by the end, there were a little over 300 homes up there behind a monument sign with a fountain in front of it and a clubhouse with a keypad on the door. My 11.8 acres ended up sitting directly below all of it, on the downhill side, a long green shape between the back fences of the newest houses and the tree line that runs to Dry Creek. From up there, my land looked like a gap in the picture. I had a shop building, a gravel pad, a work trailer, a stack of track pads and undercarriage parts under a tarp, and a tree row I had never cut because it broke the wind. For years, nobody cared. The first 2 association presidents were fine. One of them, a retired plumber, used to walk down and buy my scrap steel for a project he never finished. Nobody sent me anything. Nobody looked at me sideways. Then Lenora Vance became president, and my mailbox started filling up. She wanted me to install the fence style the association had selected, at my expense, along a boundary that was legally none of her business. She wanted my work trailer moved out of view of the homes above. She wanted the shop repainted in an approved color. She wanted a row of my trees taken down because a homeowner on the ridge felt they blocked a sight line. She wanted the association to be granted use of the small gravel lane that runs along the north side of my property, so that landscaping crews could reach the retention area without going around. Every single time, I answered with the same 7 words. My property is not in the association. We had one conversation, maybe 2 years before the excavator, that told me everything. She came down the gravel lane in a white sedan, stepped out in heels onto my driveway, and stood there while I finished torquing a bolt on a final drive. When I stood up, she looked at my coveralls, at the grease on my forearms, at the parts laid out on cardboard, and she waited just long enough to make sure I understood she was looking. Then she said, "You may not be in the association on paper, Dorian, but everyone around you has to look at your property." But this time was different in a way that mattered enormously, and I understood it standing there in the wet grass at 6:30 in the morning. She had not sent a letter. She had not called. She had not asked for permission, or offered money, or proposed a meeting, or floated the idea at a barbecue. She had skipped all of it and brought a machine. You do not bring a machine unless you have decided that asking is a risk you cannot afford. While Wade stood there with his hands on his hips and Lenora sipped her coffee, my mind was going through the closing folder in my head. Instrument 14-7721 was a temporary construction easement. The prior owner of my parcel had granted it to the Hawthorne Ridge Development Company more than a decade earlier. It allowed the developer to move equipment across a defined strip of ground during the construction of Phase 2, to stage materials, and to maintain a temporary erosion control feature while they built. The term was 18 months. At the end of 18 months, the rights terminated automatically. not renewable at the developer's option, not convertible into anything permanent. There was no drainage right conveyed. There was no right to excavate a channel. There was no right to construct or maintain a permanent outfall. There was no successor language handing anything to a homeowners association that did not even exist yet when the document was signed. All of that was on the third page, and the third page was not in the packet Lenora had handed her contractor. I looked up from the clipboard and asked her, calmly, where page 3 was. She did not look at the packet. She looked at me. "Don't play lawyer with me, Dorian." That was the moment the morning changed, and I could see it land on Wade Harlan's face before it landed anywhere else. He looked at the packet in my hands. He looked at Lenora. He looked back at the packet. A contractor knows exactly what it means when a client refuses to produce a page. I handed the clipboard back to him and said, "If she is that certain, let her hand you page 3. Lenora said nothing at all. Wade told her he was not putting the machine back in the ground until somebody produced a complete instrument and a permit, and that he would idle down and wait for a call. He was polite about it. He was also immovable, and he had every right to be, because the person who operates the equipment is the person standing in the hole when a lawsuit lands. Lenora's composure held, but it thinned. She told him the association's legal department would resolve the matter, and that the crew should expect to remobilize within a few days. She said it in the direction of Wade, but she meant it for me. Then she started up the slope toward her car, and about halfway she turned around and delivered the line that I have thought about more than anything else she ever said to me. "You're putting 300 homeowners at risk over your own pride." She drove off. The dust settled. Wade shrugged at me, said he was sorry for the trouble, and pulled the machine back off my ground and onto the association side of the line before he trailered out. I appreciated that more than he knew, and then I stood there in the quiet with that sentence turning over in my head. 300 homeowners at risk. That sentence was not a threat. It was a leak. So I went and looked at the stakes. I walked the whole disturbed area with a tape and a notebook, the way I would walk any job before I priced it. And what I found was not a path. The stakes were not laid out to mark an access route or a maintenance corridor or the footprint of an existing feature. They ran in a long continuous line that started up at the Hawthorne Ridge boundary, dropped down through the swale on my east side, curved around the low ground, and pointed straight at the tree row and the drop to Dry Creek beyond it. There were cut marks written on the lath in grease pencil. Depths. The deepest called for just under 4 feet. Nobody digs a 4-foot trench across a neighbor's field to maintain something. That is not maintenance. That is a channel. They were not restoring a drainage feature. They were building a new one, and they were building it on my land. I went inside, pulled up the county topographic layer on my laptop, and traced it out with a finger on the screen. It took about 90 seconds to see the whole shape of it. The line of stakes would carry water from the association's retention pond, which sits up on the northwest corner of the subdivision behind the clubhouse, down across my parcel, and discharge it into Dry Creek at the bottom of my tree row. Every heavy rain, every summer storm that parks itself over the ridge for an hour, all of that volume off 300 roofs and all those driveways, and that new parking lot would come off the ridge, through a channel, across my ground, in a concentrated flow. That is what she meant by risk. It was not my pride putting anyone in danger. It was the fact that Hawthorne Ridge had a water problem, and Lenora Vance had decided to solve it with my dirt. Then I found the second thing, and the second thing is what turned this from a boundary argument into something much larger. Near the tree row, half buried in leaf litter and grown over with honeysuckle, there was a section of large, concrete pipe. I had known about it for years. Every rural parcel has a piece of concrete somewhere that predates you, and I had always assumed it was an old culvert from when the county road on the north side was regraded, abandoned and left in place. But that morning I looked at it with different eyes. I got down and cleared the growth off the end of it. It was not abandoned. The invert was clean. There was a scour pocket below it where water had been coming out for years, cutting into the soil, and the vegetation pattern around it was the flat matted kind you get from repeated flow, not from a dry pipe. I followed the alignment back with a compass and my own 2 feet. That pipe did not come from the county road. It ran uphill and northwest, straight toward the Hawthorne Ridge retention pond. Then I called Nolan Pierce. Nolan is an independent licensed surveyor, 58 years old, been working Redwood County since before the subdivisions. I had rebuilt the hydraulics on a small dozer for him years back, and we had stayed friendly. I sent him 4 photographs and a rough description. He looked at them for about 10 seconds. Then he called me back instead of texting, which told me something on its own. "Dorian," he said, "are you sure this pipe is entirely on your land?" He said, "Then that is the first thing we measure." The next morning I drove into the county seat and went to the recorder's office to pull the certified copy of Instrument 14-7721. It cost me a few dollars and about 40 minutes of waiting on a bench with a paper number in my hand, and it was the best money I have ever spent. The complete recorded instrument confirmed every single thing I remembered. Page 1, the parties and the description of the strip. Page 2, the permitted uses, which were access, staging, and temporary erosion control during construction of Phase 2. Page 3, the term, temporary construction easement, term, 18 months from the date of recording. Upon expiration, all rights granted revert to the grantor without further action. No permanent drainage right, no right to excavate, no right to construct, maintain, or repair an outfall structure. No successor clause naming any homeowners association. I made 2 certified copies. I drove home, laid the county original next to the packet photograph I had taken off Wade's clipboard with my phone, and put them side by side on my kitchen table. The association's version had page 1. The association's version had page 2. There was no page 3. The signature block on page 2 ran to the bottom margin, and if you did not know a 3rd page existed, the document looked complete. That is the part I want you to understand. It was not a crude forgery. Nothing was whited out. Nothing was altered. A page was simply not there, and the pages that remained were the pages that made the association look right. Nolan came out 2 days later with his crew and spent most of the day on my east line. He set control, tied into the recorded corners, and shot the pipe, the outfall, the stakes, and the disturbed area. The results were worse than I expected. The concrete pipe carrying stormwater off Hawthorne Ridge did not stop at the property line. The end of it, the actual discharge point, the outfall, sat approximately 9 feet inside my boundary, not on the line, not straddling it. 9 feet in, with a headwall structure and a section of riprap that had been placed by human hands, all of it on my side. And the excavator stakes had been set to convert that outfall into a full constructed discharge channel running the length of my low ground. Nolan stood there with his field book and said it plainly. If they dig to these stakes, this is not maintenance. This is a new system. That afternoon, I called the Redwood County Stormwater Division and asked to speak with someone about an unpermitted discharge structure. 2 days after that, an inspector named Calvin Rourke drove out. 55, gray mustache, county truck with a magnetic decal, the kind of man who has been lied to so many times that he has stopped reacting to any of it. He was not on my side. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to how this ended. He was not on the association's side either. He asked me short questions and wrote down short answers and did not once tell me what he thought. Then he went back to his truck and ran the address through the county system on his laptop while I stood in my own driveway with my hands in my pockets. There was no grading permit for the work. There was no recorded permanent drainage easement across my parcel. There was no landowner authorization on file. And there was no signature from me on anything, anywhere, in any file because I had never signed anything. Calvin issued a stop work directive on the spot, covering all activity on my parcel until the documentation was resolved, and he told me a copy would go to the association and to the contractor that afternoon. Lenora called me at about 4 that day. The pleasant tone was entirely gone. She told me I had dragged the county into a neighbor matter that 2 reasonable adults could have handled over a fence. She told me the association had been managing that drainage for years without a single complaint from anyone. She told me I had turned a maintenance item into a bureaucratic disaster that would cost people money. Then she said, "You're playing a game you can't afford to play, Dorian." I told her I did not start the game. Her excavator did. She hung up on me. An hour later, Calvin Rourke sent me an email. It was 3 sentences long, and it changed the entire shape of this thing. In reviewing the file, the county had located an engineering report concerning the Hawthorne Ridge retention pond, submitted 2 months earlier, and the name on the transmittal page, as the person who received it on behalf of the association, was Lenora Vance. The report had been prepared by a civil engineer named Grant Ellison, 49 years old, a licensed professional with an office 2 towns over and no dog in this fight whatsoever. The retention pond at Hawthorne Ridge was failing, not dramatically, not about to burst, but failing in the slow, expensive, undeniable way that infrastructure fails when nobody funds it. The embankment had settled and needed reinforcement. Seepage had been observed on the downstream face. The principal spillway structure was undersized, and most importantly, the overflow system no longer had the capacity for the volume the subdivision was now producing. That last part had a cause, and the report named it. The association had taken a shared open parcel inside the community, a green area that had been absorbing rainfall for years, and converted it into an expanded parking lot and a new clubhouse with a paved apron. Grant Ellison's report calculated the change in impervious surface and the resulting increase in peak runoff, and the numbers were not subtle. They had added a substantial amount of hard surface and had not enlarged the pond that received it. The engineer gave the association 2 options. Option A was to repair and enlarge the retention pond and rebuild the outfall and overflow system entirely inside association-owned property. Reinforce the embankment, replace the principal spillway, expand the storage volume, and route the discharge through a properly designed structure on ground the association already controlled. The cost estimate was significant. It was the kind of number that becomes a special assessment, a line item on every single homeowner's statement, a figure people say out loud in a parking lot in an angry voice. Option B was to construct a new outfall and conveyance channel that carried the excess discharge through the adjacent property to the south and down to Dry Creek. But Option B carried a condition, and Grant Ellison wrote it in plain language that a child could understand. Any conveyance of stormwater across adjacent private property would require a recorded permanent drainage easement and the written authorization of the landowner. The landowner was me. Grant Ellison had recommended in writing that the association contact me directly to discuss whether a permanent easement could be negotiated. He had said it was the necessary first step before any design work proceeded. Lenora never contacted me, and I understood why, sitting there at my own table, better than I would have understood it from any lawyer's explanation. If she asked me, I might say no. That was the obvious risk. But it was not the real one. The real one was that I might say yes. On terms, I might ask for compensation. I might ask for design changes, for erosion protection, for a maintenance agreement, for a survey, for engineering review at the association's expense. Any of that would have required Lenora to go to her own board and to the membership and explain that the association needed to buy rights from the man on the other side of the fence. The man she had spent 2 years describing as an eyesore, and that it was going to cost money either way. And the moment the pond became a topic in an open meeting, Option A would become a topic too. And Option A had a price tag that would land on 300 statements. Lenora Vance was 6 weeks out from standing for re-election as president, so she picked a third path that the engineer never offered. She took an expired temporary construction easement out of the developer's old file, removed the page that defined its term, and used the remaining 2 pages as authority to send a machine onto my land. The contractor was told the scope was routine drainage restoration. Wade Harlan told me that himself later, and I believed him, because a man who shuts down a machine within 4 minutes of a challenge is not a man who knew he was trespassing. And now I understood the coffee cup. She stood out there that morning to watch because speed was the entire plan. Once a channel is cut, everything changes. Once the ground is open, and the grade is altered, and water is already running in a new line, the argument stops being about permission and starts being about restoration. And restoration arguments take years and lawyers and money. Facts on the ground are worth more than paperwork to a person who does not have the paperwork. She wanted that trench finished before I ever had a reason to walk to the recorder's office. The machine ran for less than 1 hour. 2 days later, an email went out to the full Hawthorne Ridge membership under Lenora's signature. It did not name me. It did not have to. It described a critical community safety project that had been delayed by an adjacent landowner obstructing access to a long-established drainage corridor, and it warned that any resulting damage during the coming storm season would be the direct consequence of that obstruction. She turned me into the villain in about 200 words, and she did it in language careful enough that no attorney would ever call it defamation. I did not respond to any of it. I did not write a rebuttal. I did not go door to door. I saved the email. I printed it. It went in the folder with everything else, because I had figured out by then what the folder was actually for. 3 days after that, a notice arrived in my mailbox, forwarded by a resident I did not know and had never spoken to, which told me something all by itself. Hawthorne Ridge Homeowners Association, special meeting. Among the agenda items listed third, in bold type, drainage obstruction caused by adjacent landowner. I read it twice. Then I put on a clean shirt, put the folder under my arm, and decided I would attend. The clubhouse meeting room was full. Somewhere between 80 and 100 people, folding chairs in rows, a long table at the front with 5 board members behind it, and a projector nobody used. I came in a few minutes late on purpose and stood at the back against the wall by the door. Lenora sat at the center of the table with a leather portfolio open in front of her and her reading glasses on. She looked good. She always looked good. She ran a tight meeting, and I will give her that much honestly, because she moved through the first 2 agenda items in 9 minutes. Then she got to the third one, and the room changed temperature. She built the story carefully. She said the association had a long-standing drainage corridor along the southern boundary. She said routine restoration work had been scheduled to protect homes from flooding in the coming season. She said the work had been halted by a dispute raised by the adjacent landowner, and that the association was now facing delay, exposure, and additional cost. She never once said my name in that opening. She said the adjacent landowner, over and over, until it stopped being a person and became an obstacle. Then she held up a document, 2 pages, stapled. "We have an easement," she said. The room made that low approving sound a room makes when someone in charge holds up paper. From the back, I said, loud enough to carry, "Do you have all 3 pages?" I have never heard a room go quiet that fast. Maybe 100 heads turned. Lenora looked at the back wall and found me, and I watched her decide, in about a second and a half, to pretend she had not heard a question. She set the document down and moved on, and she made her second mistake right there, because she moved on by going after me personally. "For those who don't know," she said in that same pleasant, flat voice, "Mr. Hale repairs machinery. He's very good at it, I'm sure, and it's useful work. But the stormwater system for a community of 300 homes needs to be handled by people who understand land planning." A few people laughed. Not many. Enough. I want to be honest about what that felt like, standing at the back of a room in a clean shirt with grease permanently in the creases of my knuckles, being told in front of 100 neighbors that I was a useful pair of hands who should leave the thinking to my betters. I felt it in my chest and up the back of my neck. I have felt it before in other rooms, in other years, and I recognized it the way you recognize a smell from childhood. And I did what I have learned to do, which is nothing. Anger is the only thing I could have given her that she could have used. If I had raised my voice, that is what everybody in that room would have remembered. They would have remembered the angry man at the back, and every word of hers would have been confirmed. So I let it sit. I let the small laugh die out into an awkward silence, which is what small, cruel laughs do when the target does not flinch. Then I asked one question. I asked whether the engineer, Grant Ellison, was present. Lenora said that an engineer was not necessary for a procedural discussion, and that is when Tessa Rowe spoke. Tessa is 43, the association treasurer, and up until that evening she had been solidly behind Lenora on everything. She had voted with her, defended her, handled her budgets. She was not looking for a fight. She was looking at her own paperwork, and she was confused, which is a far more dangerous thing. "What engineering report?" Tessa said. Lenora did not answer immediately. It was a small pause, maybe 2 seconds. But 2 seconds at a board table with 100 people watching is a very long time. Tessa asked again, and she turned in her chair to face the center of the table when she did it. She said she wanted to know whether there was an engineering report on the retention pond, because she did not recall one being distributed to the board. Lenora said a preliminary assessment had been received, and that it was under review. I raised the folder. I said I had a copy of that report, obtained from the county public file, and that I would be glad to leave a copy with the board. I read one sentence, the sentence about conveyance across adjacent private property requiring a recorded permanent drainage easement and the written authorization of the landowner. Then I looked at the table and asked, "Lenora, do you have my signature?" Silence. She said the association was not relying on the report's option B. She said the association was relying on the existing recorded easement, which predated all of this. So I walked up the center aisle, and I laid page 3 of Instrument 14-7721 on the table in front of her, county certified, with the recorder's stamp on it. Temporary construction easement. Term, 18 months. Recorded more than a decade ago. I did not say anything else. I did not need to. Tessa picked it up. The man on the end of the table leaned over to read it. Somebody in the second row asked out loud what it said, and somebody else told him. Lenora recovered faster than I expected. That is the thing about a person like her. She does not experience being wrong as a reason to stop. She said that even if the written instrument had expired, the association had established historic drainage rights across that ground through decades of continuous use, and that such rights exist independent of any document. I did not debate her. I said 7 words. The county is examining exactly that question. And for the first time in 2 years, I watched Lenora Vance lose her footing in public. Not much. A half second where her eyes went to the county certified page on the table, and then to the room, and then back down. Because a homeowners association president can outlast a neighbor. She cannot outlast a county stormwater division. The meeting should have ended there. It did not, because Tessa Rowe had been sitting with her budget binder open the entire time, and Tessa asked the question that finished the evening. She said, "If the easement has not been confirmed, why did the association already pay a mobilization deposit to the excavation contractor?" Nobody said a word, not one person in that room. Grant Ellison, once the county contacted him directly, produced his correspondence file. And in it was an email he had sent to Lenora Vance 2 months before the excavator ever rolled off the trailer. It said, in language that left no room at all, that no excavation should occur on the Hale parcel prior to obtaining a recorded permanent easement and written landowner consent, and that proceeding without those would expose the association to liability. She received it. She never replied to it, and 9 days later she signed the work order authorizing the contractor to mobilize. Tessa, meanwhile, went through the association's financial records line by line, and she found how it had been done. The expenditure had never been presented to the board as a construction project at all. It had been described, in the minutes and in the approval request, as maintenance of an existing drainage corridor. Maintenance falls under the President's routine authority. Maintenance does not require a membership vote. Maintenance does not require competitive bids or an engineering review or notice to the community. Construction requires all of it. One word. That was the entire mechanism. Change the word and the process disappears. While that was happening, Nolan Pierce finished and sealed his survey, and it delivered the piece that nobody, including me, had seen coming. The concrete pipe was not the only thing across my line. The entire outfall structure was. The head wall, the apron, the riprap, and roughly 9 feet of pipe all sat on my parcel. And when the county searched the historical record for any permanent drainage easement, any recorded agreement, any grant of rights from any prior owner of my land covering that structure, they found nothing, which meant that for years the Hawthorne Ridge Homeowners Association had been discharging the stormwater of 300 homes through a structure on private property they had no recorded right to occupy. It had been running that way since the developer walked away. Nobody had checked, because nothing had ever forced anybody to check, and here is the part I still think about. She brought an excavator onto my land to avoid a conversation, and the excavator triggered a full audit of the association's entire stormwater system. She told me, standing in my own field with a coffee in her hand, that I did not understand infrastructure. Her own decision put every piece of her infrastructure under a county microscope from the pond down to the creek. The county issued its findings in a written order. All work on my parcel was to cease. The disturbed area was to be restored to its prior condition and stabilized. The outfall structure was to be evaluated for legal status and hydraulic adequacy. The association was required to submit an engineered remediation plan for the retention pond. And any future stormwater conveyance across adjacent private property would require a recorded permanent easement, written landowner consent, and a grading permit before a single bucket touched dirt. I asked for one thing, and I put it in writing so there could never be a question about what I wanted. Not one additional drop of water crosses my property without a signed agreement. That was it. That was the whole demand. Lenora was not finished. I will give her credit for stamina, if nothing else. She requested a formal hearing before the county, asserting that my documentation did not reflect the actual historical use of the ground, and that the association's long-standing practice established rights the recorder's office had simply failed to capture. I went to that hearing. I wore a jacket. I brought the folder. And Lenora did not know that Calvin Rourke had invited one additional person to attend. Grant Ellison. She opened well. She always did. She described a community that had maintained a drainage corridor for years, an aging system in need of restoration, a scheduled routine project, and an adjacent owner who had escalated a simple matter into a formal proceeding. She said the excavation had been intended only to restore an existing feature to its original function. Calvin Rourke let her finish. Then he asked one question, in the flattest voice I have ever heard a man use. If this was an existing feature, why does Mr. Ellison's drawing label it proposed new swale? She did not answer. Her attorney looked at her, and she did not answer him either. Calvin turned to Grant Ellison and asked him to confirm. Grant said the alignment staked on my property was a proposed new conveyance channel, that it did not exist in any form prior to the staking, that it was drawn as part of Option B in his report, and that Option B had never been approved for design because the required landowner authorization had never been obtained. Then Calvin asked him whether he had communicated that requirement to the association. Grant said he had communicated it in writing to the association president by name on a specific date 2 months before the work began, and that he had received no response. He handed over the email. Calvin moved on to the easement. Lenora's attorney submitted the association's copy, 2 pages, stapled. Calvin laid the county-certified copy directly beside it and turned to the 3rd page, term 18 months. Expired more than a decade earlier, with a subsequent recorded acknowledgement of termination filed by the developer itself. Then Nolan Pierce presented his sealed survey and established that the outfall structure sat approximately 9 feet inside my boundary, with no recorded easement of any kind supporting it. Nobody shouted. Nobody was arrested. There was no confrontation, no dramatic reveal, no moment where anyone pointed a finger across a table. There was just a woman who had once stood on my land with a travel mug, entirely certain that I was too small to matter, now being asked to explain why she had sent a machine onto another person's property after her own licensed engineer told her in writing not to. She said the association had acted in good faith based on documentation in its files. Calvin asked her whether she had read the documentation in her files. She said she relied on staff. The county denied the association's petition. The project was suspended. The association was directed back to option A, the repair and expansion of the retention pond entirely within its own property, and the outfall structure was placed under a compliance review that the association would have to resolve with me directly. Outside in the hallway, while her attorney was packing the box, Lenora came over to me. She stood closer than she needed to, and she kept her voice low, and I will remember the exact words as long as I live. "Do you have any idea how much money you just cost several hundred families?" I said no. "The engineering report you buried did that." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. And then her attorney called her name from down the hall, and she turned and walked away. And that was the last time Lenora Vance ever spoke to me. The Hawthorne Ridge board called a special session 11 days later. This time, every member received the complete package in advance. Grant Ellison's full engineering report on the retention pond, including both options and both cost estimates. His warning email to the president, with the date on it. The complete recorded easement with all 3 pages, and the developer's termination acknowledgement. Nolan's sealed survey. The contractor's invoice showing the mobilization deposit. The county's written order. And the membership email describing an adjacent landowner as an obstruction to community safety. Lenora lost the room in under an hour. Tessa Rowe led the motion for a change in leadership. She did it carefully and without theatrics, and I respect how she handled it, because she had been on Lenora's side for 2 years, and it would have been much easier for her to stay quiet and let it pass. The vote was not close. What actually happened to her was the only thing that could have actually reached her. She lost the position. The title was the instrument she had used to look at people and decide where they belonged, and it was taken away from her by the very people she had used it in front of. The association hired an engineering firm and moved forward with option A. They reinforced the embankment, replaced the principal spillway, and expanded the pond's storage volume to handle the runoff their own parking lot had created. It cost more than the trench across my land would have cost. Considerably more. There was a special assessment, and people were not happy about it, and I understand that completely. But it was done with permits and stamped drawings and inspections and a public bid, and every homeowner knew what they were paying for and why. The outfall on my parcel was addressed separately. The association and I negotiated, through counsel on their side and a plain conversation on mine, a recorded permanent easement covering the existing structure at its existing capacity. With a maintenance obligation on the association, an annual inspection, and a hard limit prohibiting any increase in flow without a new written agreement. They paid a fair price for it, not a punishing one, a fair one. The area the excavator tore up was restored by the contractor, regraded and reseeded, and the association paid the invoice without argument. I did not ask for damages beyond restoration. I did not ask for a settlement. I asked for the ground to be put back the way it was. And a few weeks after all of it was over, on a Tuesday morning, I woke up to the sound of an excavator again. I lay there for a second with my heart going, the way you do when a sound reaches back and grabs something in you. Then I got up and went to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Same yellow machine, same size, same scrape of steel through soil. But it was on the other side of the line. It was up on association ground, working the pond embankment, and there was a truck parked beside it, with a permit placard in the windshield and a rolled set of stamped drawings on the hood. There was an engineer in a vest walking the toe of the slope with a level rod. There were survey stakes, set by a licensed surveyor, every one of them where they belonged. Nobody was on my property. Nobody had any reason to be. Wade Harlan was in the cab. He saw me at the window, and he lifted one hand off the joystick and gave me a wave. I raised a hand back. I took my coffee out to the porch that morning and stood there and watched them work, and I want to describe that picture, because it is the whole story compressed into one frame. The first morning, Lenora Vance stood on my land with a coffee cup and watched a machine dig where it had no right to be. The last morning, I stood on my own porch with a coffee cup and watched a machine repair the thing the association should have repaired from the beginning, on the association's own ground, with the association's own money, under the association's own name, on the permit. Lenora is not the president anymore. The reserved space at the clubhouse with the small sign that said president on it has a different name on it now, and I have driven past it more than once and noticed. What satisfies me is smaller and simpler than revenge, and it took me a while to put words to it. A boundary is not a suggestion. It is not a matter of who has more education, or a better job title, or a nicer car, or a seat at the center of a table with a nameplate in front of it. The authority of a homeowners association stops precisely where my property line begins, and it does not matter one bit whether the person holding that authority believes I am the kind of man who should be standing on the other side of it. I think about what she said to me that first morning, with her sunglasses in her hair and the mug in her hand, before she knew any of what was coming. Don't make life difficult for people who understand land planning better than you do. Here is the truth of it. I never had to understand more than everyone else. I do not know more about hydrology than Grant Ellison. I could not have run Nolan's survey. I could not have written the county's order. I only had to do one thing, and it was the one thing Lenora Vance never once imagined I was capable of doing, because she had already decided what kind of man I was the first time she looked at my hands. I read the third page. The morning she brought that excavator, she stood on my land like she had already won. What she never understood is that the first time that bucket came down, she was not digging a channel at all. She was digging out the ground beneath her own chair.